South Africa's economic crisis precedes the outbreak of COVID-19. Stagnant growth, massive unemployment and structural inequalities were all features of South Africa's economic reality before the national state of disaster grinded the economy and economic activity to a halt. So if we can't return to the old, as the SACP argues, what is to be done and where are we going? The SACP's Jeremy Cronin helps me to unpack this issue. Jeremy, thank you for joining me on The Fix. In an article you penned in the Umsebenzi Online titled "We Know There's No Going Back, but Where Are We Heading To?" you essentially make the point that there's agreement in South Africa that we, can't fight the coronavirus and we simply can't return to what immediately preceded the lockdown. But you're saying, what will this new economy and this new global reality look like? From the SACP's perspective, what is it that needs urgent attention, that needs to navigate what a new economic model ought to look like?
Thanks, Karima. Yeah, no, I think that, and I was very pleased to see that President Ramaphosa also repeated this theme, that we can't go back to the so-called normal before the normal, because it was extremely abnormal for the great majority of South Africans. And indeed, we can't go back to the world, and won't be, because clearly it's a world in which has been turned upside down by the pandemic. I think there are many lessons. One of the big debates has, of course, been the role of the Reserve Bank, and whether South Africa should take on loans from the IMF and World Bank. But I think behind those debates lies a big structural issue, and that is that we have been on a very problematic, a destructive path since the mid-1990s. There's been massive capital flight out of South Africa as a result of trade deregulation of capital markets, and huge capital flight amounting to something like 20% of GDP in 2007. And so as a result, we've been excessively reliant on short-term and flighty capital coming into the country. We've been reliant on very high interest rates to attract that capital. So I think that going forward, we've got to really discipline capital much more effectively than we did from the mid-1990s. I think that's been perhaps the biggest lesson that we need to learn.
Now, when you talk about disciplining capital, Jeremy, are you suggesting, let's go to the question that you put on the table, which is capital flight. Are you calling for stricter capital control measures to be adopted in terms of South Africa's current policy? Are you asking for that policy to be relooked? Particularly in the current environment?
No, absolutely. I think we've got to look at much greater effective regulation of capital flight. I mean, a lot of it has been illegal, and I think that we have not been effective at dealing with that. So that's something we've got to look at. We've got to put, I think, much more effective controls on capital movements. We allowed excessive foreign listings of some of our major companies, and that has also been a major source of loss of capital. Then also we need to look at the agreements that were reached in the financial sector accords back in 2001, 2003, 2004, and the financial sector charter. I mean, for instance, the banks and financial sector commit to major investments in the informal sector, in the low-cost housing sector and so on. But despite the commitments, very little has been done. So that would be another form of really enforcing actual agreements that are in place in charters and things like that. So I think that is one massive area that we need to look at.
One of the things that you do raise in your paper is the international financial lending institutions, the role of the IMF and the World Bank, and the conditionality realities. And I like the fact that in the paper you do speak to a nuanced look at these institutions. You do say that within these institutions there is in fact debate about conditionalities and whether loans that are paid back or taken out and paid back should be paid in dollar or rand terms or local currency terms. Just to get clarity, Jeremy, the South African Communist Party's position on South Africa going to the World Bank and the IMF to deal specifically with COVID-19. Are you supportive of this measure?
Well, we are saying that we need to be extremely cautious about dealing with institutions like the World Bank and IMF. Obviously, we take note of the fact that there are special instruments which they have brought into being as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Obviously, because the global economy is in trouble, and even the IMF and World Bank realize that exceptional measures are required. Some of these lending arrangements would carry a very low interest, at least on the face of it. They would still be loans, they wouldn't be grants, but they would be dollar denominated. And I think that that is something that we need to be very cautious about, because one of the great strengths that we have, relative strengths that we have as South Africa compared to many other countries in the South and all of our African neighbors, is that the bulk of our public debt is rand denominated. This would be dollar denominated, and obviously the danger is that the rand will, the exchange rate between rand and dollar could slide quite dramatically and unfavorably to us, and so we could end up with something that looked like it was a very low interest, but it could become extremely expensive. So we need to practice a great deal of caution.
Absolutely. Now, the other thing, of course, is also just this call for radical economic transformation. You say in the paper that radical economic transformation is there. It is a call that the SACP has long made, but it is also a term terribly debased by the state capture RET bunch. And you say empowerment is mentioned, but interestingly and significantly without preceding adjectives of black and inclusive. And of course, there is where, we should look at the question of pleasing everybody. When one talks about radical economic transformation, how does one advance radical economic action as opposed to radical economic rhetoric that is often, used as a lexicon for the state capture forces and has very little to do with, addressing working class and poor communities?
Yeah, no, you've kind of summarized what I would want to say. I mean, I think, the big debate, which is going to shape up inside of the ANC, but also more broadly, ANC movement, is the meaning, and President Ramaphosa referred both to structural transformation as well as radical economic transformation, and he repeated the call for radical economic transformation again. Now, what do we mean by structural transformation and radical economic transformation? And I think for the SACP, we actually mean the same thing by both those terms. Radical transformation means getting to the origin of the word radical, getting to the root of our structural problems inside South Africa. And we've got many structural problems. I've referred to one, this huge dependence, structural dependence, systemic dependence on hot money, basically. I mean, we're extraordinarily wasteful of our domestic resources. I mean, with an unemployment rate of 40%, 50%, that's another huge waste of people who want to work, who want to contribute to our economy and can't because structurally we're unable to do it. Spatially, we obviously still have a deep-seated legacy of apartheid spatial arrangements in our cities, for instance, which then kicks on into all of the other problems of labor, lack of labor productivity, people having to travel long distances and unsafe minibuses and so forth, all of which has come to the fore dramatically with the pandemic and the lockdown, all of these structural problems. So we need radical transformation, but radical transformation can't just be a couple of slogans, nationalize the Reserve Bank, which frankly is an irrelevance. or expropriation without compensation. We need to radical transformation means addressing the huge systemic problems that we've got in the economy and in our society more broadly.
Now, one of the ways in which the president has, in fact, gone about trying to get different social partners in the room to make those tough trade-offs that will obviously come as a consequence of tough debate and bargaining is social compacting. You refer to it here in your paper, but there's a lot of weaknesses in that social compact. I mean, we've seen, for example, NEDLAC institutions, don't have all the players in because, for example, the labour movement is very fractured. But often, Jeremy, these agreements are very general. When we have to dig down to the nitty-gritty, you will actually see that people aren't actually as close to a common understanding as one would have liked. Do you think that social compacting in its current form takes us to reimagining and charting new ways of imagining the economy?
Yeah, look, I think that we've obviously, I think we've seen positive developments in the midst of the COVID pandemic. I think that the initial initiatives from President Ramaphosa and his cabinet in regard to consulting with key partners, with as many partners as possible, I think proved to be an important success and enabled South Africa to respond to the pandemic in ways that were far better than many other countries, including some highly developed countries, clearly. So I think that it is an important tradition that we've got in South Africa, and certainly one of the great strengths of President Ramaphosa himself. But you're absolutely right. We've got to learn lessons from the compacting that we've attempted in the past, going back to the mid-1990s, when, in fact, there was a reach for a social compact. So the labour movement got progressive labour legislation, but which has been eroded completely by contracting out and all the other things that you were talking about earlier with the COSATU representative. Big business got gear, basically, and liberalisation, which has enabled capital flight. And the poor got an extensive but leaky social security net. So we've got to get back into effective compacting, but the compacting has got to contribute seriously to a new growth path, one which addresses massive unemployment in particular, and all of the other systemic problems in our society. And that means that the state has to exert a degree of leadership and needs to have the capacity to effectively police or regulate agreements that are made, as I was saying earlier, about the financial sector, Concord, the accords that we had there. On paper, not bad, but in practice, we've been unable to effectively ensure that what was agreed has got implemented.
Absolutely. Now, Jeremy, as we enter level 4 of the lockdown, many people are agitating, particularly big business, some of the opposition parties. I think the Democratic Alliance leader yesterday addressed the country on this question, and they are pushing for a much more rapid approach to opening the economy up. And several people have entered this debate, including, thinkers that are on opposite ends of the ideological spectrum. I've looked at a piece written by Brian Cantor that was put on, one of the online websites, and he makes a very important point. He speaks about the relationship between the economic costs and the medical benefits of any policy responses to an epidemic that deserves the most careful consideration. Now, there's been, in my view, a false dichotomy about opening the economy and choosing public health. When that is at the heart of this fight over how to manage the economy, what is the SACP saying here in terms of opening up the economy, but also ensuring that public health is not sacrificed as a consequence?
Yes, I think that clearly we need to, first of all, not politicize this matter. And I thought that John Steenhuisen's intervention yesterday was unfortunate, and looks like, so, and carries him into the Trump kind of camp, possibly unintentionally, but that's how it looks. It looks like the special pleading of a particular interest group in South Africa. I think that the SACP's position is that we need to be guided by the science, both medical and public health science. As well as obviously insofar as there is a science of the economy, but we need as best as possible to have an understanding. And I think we're all operating in the dark. I think that the epidemic is a new one, and our own situation with our high levels of HIV/AIDS infection, for instance, is also a novel reality in terms of the pandemic. So I think we're feeling our way, and therefore we need to be cautious but mindful and of not erecting huge dichotomies on the one hand between the public health issues and the economic and social issues. The things are deeply interlinked, and how to get the balance right is not an easy matter. And I think we need to have sympathy, but also to be guided by those who are guided by the data and by the information, and also by international experience.
Talking about data, Jeremy, as a final question, the Sunday Times is running with a headline saying, we want to avoid COVID-19 panic, and this is ascribed to presidential spokesperson Kusela Diko, whom we have tried to get onto this program to talk about what exactly she means. And essentially the piece says that the presidency acknowledged that they're not necessarily sharing all the COVID-19 data with the public because they fear panic and they fear, a response that will alarm South Africans. From the SACP's point of view, is this the correct strategy to be followed by the presidency, or should they be more transparent with South Africans?
Well, I hope the Sunday Times is getting it a bit wrong, and I don't know, and I'm not sure what the presidential spokesperson said, per se. I mean, I can imagine that there is a good reason, for instance, not to disclose necessarily the identities of people who have died or who are infected, because, for instance, so some of that sort of information is appropriate, holding it back unless there's the agreement. But I heard the COSATU spokesperson earlier saying exactly what I would want to say, is that overwhelmingly, I think what has been good about government so far has been that it has been transparent. It's tried to convey as much information as possible to us, and often on a daily basis. And I think that, we need to practice social solidarity, and we need to have all South Africans collectively involved in the effort to address this challenge that we've got, and the maximum amount of transparency is absolutely essential.
All right, that's where we will leave it. Thank you so much to the SACP's Jeremy Cronin. Still ahead, new economic models that ensures shared growth and an equitable South Africa. Stay with us.